Alright, let's not pussyfoot around. Y'all know exactly what time it is. So, quick recap. What we're effectively looking at in the situation in Ukraine from the long-standing point of view is that before the conflict even kicked off, Ukraine was in fact committing war crimes against its own Russian-speaking citizens. Said regions decided to go independent, and effectively, well, there was a guerrilla warfare between the two. The two regions managed to fight off the Ukrainians and go ahead and try to declare autonomy. Didn't necessarily go well, so they decided to effectively implement the Minsk Accords, which was that everybody keep the fuck out of Ukraine and let Ukraine solve its own internal problems. Russia decided to go ahead and stay out of it. Western powers, on the other hand, not only encouraged, shall we say, the disagreement of the Minsk Accords, though they kept trying to alter that into the Normandy format, and basically also encouraged the continued war crimes against Ukraine's own civilians. These two independent republics in Ukraine that are effectively trying to separate themselves out, Donbass and Luhansk respectively, petitioned Russia for a military alliance and guaranteed protection. Russia took a long consideration of what to do with it and decided to go ahead and recognize these two regions as their own independent power. So, what does that mean? Well, that's how we get the situation in Ukraine as it stands now. Russia decides to steamroller in, out-blitzkrieg the Germans, pincer the Ukrainian army, and straight up decimate it. They have no they have no control of the air. They have no leadership for what remains of the Ukrainian army. So what remains are militia defenses. Stuff like the Azov Battalion, all the volunteers that have been coming in to volunteer and fight for Ukraine, and being effectively treated like goddamn cannon fodder. In addition to this, you also have the militias, such as the Azov Battalion, going through and basically becoming the new ISIS. They're effectively rounding up civilians, duct taping them to poles, and beating them to, and raping them, and all sorts of other unnasty, unpleasant stuff in order to ensure that the civilians remain in the cities. Russia, as per the doctrine of flowing water, and also part of the doctrine of blitzkrieg, has ignored the cities for the time being, encircled them, and decided to siege them out. Now that they have most control of Ukraine, at least in terms of how much territory they've covered, now they are beginning the tough work of urban combat. And as any soldier will tell you, urban combat is not exactly fun. So, with that being said, we kind of come to the part where the article starts to draw to a conclusion. Ultimately, because this article is several months out of date as far as the recent events going on in Ukraine right about now, but it at least goes up to the incident regarding a hospital, where it appeared that the Russians had committed a war crime by attacking a medical institution. When said medical institution was basically taken over, all the medical personnel and all the patients inside were evacuated, and the place was effectively turned into a military base with a hospital outside. Not exactly conductive, is it? So let's go ahead and take a look at the ultimate conclusions that Jacques here has drawn up. Part 3. Conclusions. As a former intelligence professional, the first thing that strikes me is the total absence of Western intelligence services in representing the situation for a year. In Switzerland, the services have been criticized for not providing a correct picture of the situation. In fact, it seems all over the Western world, the services have been overwhelmed by politicians. The problem is that it is the politicians who decide. The best intelligence service in the world is useless if the decision maker does not listen to it. This is what happened during that crisis. I feel for this guy because I understand exactly what he's talking about. You can have the best intelligence in the world, but if your leadership does not make its decision or decide to pay attention to its intelligence, shit can go very wrong very quickly. That said, while some intelligence services had a very precise and rational image of the situation, others clearly had the same image that is propagated by our media. See Poland. The problem is that, by experience, I have found that they were extremely bad on the analytical level. doctrine, they do not have the intellectual or political independence necessary to apply a situation with a military quality. It is better to have them as enemies than as friends. He's basically talking about the talking heads who appear on the major news networks, basically saying, oh yeah, everything is fine, everything is going well, nothing is absolutely wrong here. And yet, things are not what they seem, because apparently Ukraine is still requesting a bunch of aid in terms of manpower, millions of dollars, if not billions, thanks Joe Biden, as well as war materials. And now it seems they might actually be losing. Some of the news coverage that has come out recently shows a very bleak situation for Ukraine. Not exactly the romanticized resistance, is it? Then, it seems that in some European countries, politicians have deliberately ignored their services to respond ideologically to the situation. This is why this crisis has been irrational from the start. It will be observed that all the documents that have been presented to the public during this crisis have been presented by politicians on the basis of commercial sources. I wonder who's pushing the narrative. Some Western politicians obviously want there to be conflict. In the United States, the attack scenarios presented by Anthony Blinken to the Security Council were only the fruit of imagination by a Tiger team working for him. He did exactly like Donald Rumsfeld in 2002, who thus bypassed the CIA and other intelligence services that were far less assertive about Iraqi chemical weapons. So when they're talking about weapons of mass destruction, they're not exactly talking about nukes. Nukes is only 1/3 of the entire thing. The entire weapons of mass destruction profile and other stuff is NBC. That is not only nuclear, it is also biological. So you might have heard that might be what C-19 was all about when that got leaked. And then there is also chemical attacks, Agent Orange, stuff like that. So the dramatic developments we are witnessing today have causes we knew about but refused to see. On the strategic level, the expansion of NATO, which we have not dealt with here. On the political level, the Western refusal to implement the Minsk agreements. And on the operational level, the continuous and repeated attacks on the civilian populations of Donbass for years, and the dramatic increase at the end of February 2002. In other words, we can naturally deplore and condemn the Russian attack. But we, that is to say the United States, France, and the European Union in the lead, have created the conditions for conflict to break out. We show compassion for the Ukrainian people and the 2 million refugees. It's good. But if we had had a modicum of compassion for the same number of refugees from the Ukrainian populations of Donbass massacred by their own government and who have been accumulating in Russia for 8 years, none of this would have probably happened. And then it kind of breaks this down. So, in 2018, the territory control led by the self-proclaimed republics, 128 territories. In government-controlled territory of Ukraine, 27. In no man's land, basically owned by nobody because nobody can reliably control it, 7. Total, 162. Decrease in comparison with the previous year, about half, we'll say. All right, and then in 2019, the number of territories led by the self-proclaimed republics, 85. In government-controlled territory, 18. In no man's land, 2. A total for 105. That's about a 32% decrease. In 2020, 61. In government-controlled territory, 9. In no man's land, 0. Total, 70. 2021, 36, 8, 44, 37.1%. Whereas the term genocide applies to the abuses suffered by the population of the Donbass is an open question. This term is generally reserved for larger cases, such as the Holocaust, etc. However, the definition, given by the Geneva Conventions, is probably broad enough to apply. Lawyers will appreciate. Clearly, this conflict has led us into hysteria. Sanctions have been seem to have become the preferred tools of our foreign policies. If we had insisted that the Ukraine respect the Minsk Accords, which we have negotiated and endorsed, none of this would have happened. The condemnation of Vladimir Putin is also ours. There is no point in whining after the fact. We had to act before. However, neither Emmanuel Macron, as guarantor and member of the UN Security Council, nor Olaf Scholz, nor Vladimir Zelensky have respected their commitments. Ultimately, the real defeat is of those who have no voice. And here he's talking about us, the average individual. The European Union was unable to promote the implementation of the Minsk agreements, and as we know previously, did not care to. On the contrary, that it did not react when Ukraine bombarded its own population in the Donbass. Had she done so, Vladimir Putin would have not needed to react. Absent from the diplomatic phase, the EU distinguished itself by fueling the conflict. On February 27th, the Ukrainian government agrees to start negotiations with Russia. But a few hours later, the European Union voted a budget of 450 million euros to supply arms to Ukraine, adding fuel to the fire. From there, the Ukrainians feel that they will not need to come to an agreement. The resistance of the Azov militias in Mariupol will even cause a raise of 500 million euros for weapons. So here it is. Russia has Ukraine by the throat and wants to bring them down to the negotiation table. Ukraine starts to agree. France basically comes out of nowhere and says, here's a whole bunch of money to buy our bombs, bandages, and bullets. Ukraine decides, yeah, we're not going to come to the negotiation table. Thus, the war continues. In Ukraine, with the blessing of the Western countries, those who are in favor of a negotiation are eliminated. This is the case of Denis Kivyev, one of the Ukrainian negotiators assassinated on March 5th by the Ukrainian Secret Service, the SBU, because he is too favorable to Russia and is considered a traitor. The same fate is reserved for Dmitry Dematskio, former deputy head of the main directorate for the SBU of Kiev and its region. He is assassinated on March 10th, because too favorable to an agreement with Russia. He is killed by the Mirovets militia, the Peacemaker. This militia is associated with the Mirtovets website, which lists the enemies of Ukraine and their personal data, address, and telephone numbers so that they can be harassed or even eliminated. A punishable practice in many countries, but not in Ukraine. The UN and some European countries have demanded its closure, refuted by Rada. So, here's what you're ultimately facing. You have a bunch of people that basically say, hey, let's actually sit down and talk with Russia. And because they are considered more favorable to actually sit down and talk with Russia, they are eliminated as traitors to the state. Seems like we don't actually want peace in the Ukraine after all, even if we've told these people to stop doing it, and they have refused to do so. It's almost like we're actually sanctioning them and to actually commit these atrocities. Wow! Eventually, the price will be high, but Vladimir Putin will likely achieve the goals he set for himself. Its ties with Beijing have solidified. China emerges as a mediator of the conflict, while Switzerland enters the list of enemies of Russia. The Americans must ask Venezuela and Iran for oil to get out of the energy impasse of which they have gotten themselves. Juan Guaidó leaves the scene definitively, and the United States must pitifully reverse the sanctions imposed on their enemies. Western ministers who seek to collapse the Russian economy and make the Russian people suffer, even calling for the assassination of Putin, show, even if they partially reverse the form of their remarks, but not on the bottom, that our leaders are no better than the ones we hate. Because sanctioning Russian athletes from the Paralympic Games or Russian artists has absolutely nothing to do with a fight against Putin. I'm effectively reminded of apparently the banning of the Russian blue cat breed from the Cat Show, and how the Steam Workshop or other video games have basically denied services to the Russian people. Why? Because they think they can help collapse the economy by not taking Russian money. That's kind of fucking stupid, because if you are in a foreign country and you want to hurt the Russian economy, you should be trying to do as much business in Russia as possible and take as much money out of the country. It's almost like these people don't understand how to actually conduct a war. Thus, therefore, we recognize that Russia is a democracy, since we consider that the Russian people are responsible for the war. If not, then why are we trying to punish an entire population for the fault of the one? Remember that collective punishment is prohibited by the Geneva Conventions. The lesson to be drawn from this conflict is our sense of variable geometry humanity. If we were so attached to peace and to Ukraine, why didn't we encourage her more to respect the agreements that she had signed that the members of the Security Council had approved, referring again to the Minsk agreements? Media integrity is measured by their willingness to work under the terms of the Munch Charter. They had succeeded in propagating the hatred of the Chinese during the COVID crisis, and their polarizing message leads to the same effect against the Russians. Journalism is stripping itself more and more of professionalism to become militant. As Goethe said, the greater the light, the darker the shadow. The more sanctions against Russia are excessive, the more cases where we have done nothing to highlight our racism and servility. Why has no Western politician reacted to the strikes against the civilian populations of Donbass for 8 years? After all, what makes the conflict in Ukraine more blameworthy than the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya? What sanctions have we adopted against those who have deliberately lied before the international community to wage unjustified and unjustifiable and murderous wars? Did we try to make suffer the American people who had lied to us because it's a democracy before the war in Iraq? Had we even adopted a single sanction against the countries, companies, or politicians who are fueling the conflict in Yemen, considered the worst humanitarian disaster in the world? Have we sanctioned the countries of the European Union who practice the most abject torture on their territory for the benefit of the United States? To ask the question is to answer it, and the answer is not glorious. So, what exactly are we even looking at in terms of what we have done in the situation in Ukraine? It's almost like we tried to propagate another forever war like we did in Iraq. People have wanted to get out of the war of Iraq. We're tired of fighting, and yet here we go with another, forever war. What we're basically seeing here is a bunch of war crimes and other atrocities that have been committed, and what have the Western powers, who have trumpeted the blessings of freedom and democracy and all that good fun stuff? Nothing. We have seen absolutely nothing. It's almost like they're actually sanctioning these atrocities to continue on so that they have a reason to get involved and blame the other guy. As Jacques has actually said here, the journalism has had no integrity, leadership does not trust the people who are in place to do their particular jobs, namely the intelligence community, and they are effectively trying to push atrocities so that they have a reason to get involved. Again, I'm repeating myself at this point, but it bears repeating. This conflict is not how it's being presented in the media. And everything leading up to this conflict shows that perhaps we are, for once, on the wrong side of history. I'm sure a lot of people are not going to be able to accept that, but it bears repeating. We are on the wrong side of history on this one. The history books are going to make it out of how Russia basically came in and saved a marginalized people who were being genocided. Of course, that is, unless the media tries to bury it and memory hold it, but the internet does not forget. And this ultimately explains why there is a lot of conflicting pictures in what the media tells us. The media tells us that Ukraine is winning, but for some reason Ukraine seems to need a whole lot of volunteers, bombs, bandages, and bullets. Those aren't cheap. It explains why Joe Biden has basically pledged $40 billion in U.S. taxpayer dollars to a country that is continuing to wage war and supposedly soundly defeating the Russians. The fact that the Russians have still not been kicked out of Ukraine after, what are we up to now? 4 months of conflict? Yeah, looks about right. So 4 months of conflict, and despite the whole rah Ukraine is winning, the underdog will, defeat the evil Putin, and the Russian citizens will rise up and assassinate the great tyrant. Doesn't seem to be happening, folks. And as someone who did also study military intelligence as part of my job, this dissonance between the two, the fact that Ukraine is supposedly winning, but Ukraine needs all this international support to even hold the line, is kind of drawing a stark contrast, and this shines a lot of what's going on here. The truth is, Russia has won. They have already completed their operational objectives at basically decapitating and basically rendering the Ukrainian official army absolutely meaningless. The only resistance now there are basically a bunch of mercenaries, freelancers, and criminals that have just basically been and not only criminals but civilians as well, who are given a gun and say, go fight the Russians. Well, they have no air control, no control of the skies. I'm repeating myself there. They have no recon capabilities, and they have no leadership. How do you expect them to fight in this condition? You can't. Hell, even in the American Revolutionary War, the militias had contact with each other. They were able to organize while the Continental Army basically marched to fight the British head on. The militias themselves were still able to wage a guerrilla war while the Continental Army marched around to face in a conventional war, and everybody was in contact with each other. This is not the same thing in Ukraine. Hopefully, you have had a chance to read this entire thing for yourself, because don't just take my word for it here. Read for it, decide for yourself. But hopefully you can see as I do, and you can see where I'm making the points here, and that this is not what we think it is. And this is not what the media has been telling to us. The fact that the media has been lying is no secret or surprise. People should not be surprised by this by now. But like I said, I have been kind of listening in on what's going on with Ukraine, and the situation does not look good for the Ukrainians. They haven't collapsed yet, but I expect that they probably will soon. I'm hearing all sorts of stories now, and the media is starting to put out the maybe Ukraine isn't going to win this after all narrative. Slowly kind of easing their way into what they thought was going to be this glorious revolution into bitter reality. And that's something we'll probably have to talk about later. This whole idea of revolution and rebellion is so romanticized due to the U.S. history of being the underdog when it was first founded, that it has become so ingrained that we romanticize all these notions of it. But the truth is, unlike the founding fathers who had a plan and wanted to found a nation after revolution, what plan do these people have? It's the same question I asked in my whole Malcolm X video where I listened to his entire speech. Revolution, I suppose, can be great and all, but what comes after? I think that's something we're going to have to sit down and take a listen to at some point. Because I've got a couple of clips that I think really kind of orchestrate this ridiculous notion that's going around in modern society today. So, with that being said, I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Go. Read these articles for yourself. Look at what the media is saying. Look at what it's not saying, because that can be just as important. Or, you can otherwise just straight up ignore me, and I may just be screaming into the void about all this.